Thank you to everyone for coming to today's session. I'm just going to wait for a minute just to let everyone get into the room, and then we'll get started. Right, so thank you everyone for coming to this, attending this webinar, Mothers, Domestic Violence and Social Work Interventions. Just some basic housekeeping just at the start, just to make sure that everyone's aware of what's going on. So we will be taking questions, but if you could put questions into the Q&A section rather than into the chat, just because sometimes the chat can get quite busy and it can be quite difficult to pick questions out. And if you put them into the Q&A, we can find them easily and respond to your questions. The raised hand function isn't working, so we're not taking live questions from people, only questions in writing through the Q&A section. And people, just so people know, sometimes people ask, the videos and sound is not enabled for participants in the webinar, only for panelists who you should be able to see. Just to remind everyone that the session is being recorded. Once this session is completed, it will be uploaded to the Wolverhampton Social Work YouTube channel so that you can come back to it later, or you can share it, or other people share it with colleagues after the event, but they are on the YouTube channel for you to access after the event, which might be helpful for recording of CPD as well. So yeah, I think that that's probably all the basic housekeeping, and I will just start by introducing briefly the panelists, and then I will let them give you a more a fuller introduction for each of them. So firstly, we've got, firstly speaking, we've got Dr. Elaine Arnull, who is the Director for the Institute of Social Work Care and the Associate Dean of the Faculty of Education, Health and Wellbeing at the University of Wolverhampton. She is an Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology, Brisbane, Australia, and she's currently Chair of the Division of Women and Crime, which is the largest division of the American Society for Criminology, which is the largest organisation of criminologists in the world. So Elaine is going to present today her recent research that she's undertaking, calling for a review of the legal frameworks and ontological assumptions underpinning child protection social work in the context of domestic violence. And then we've got Nikki Plummer. Nikki is the domestic abuse lead at Birmingham Children's Trust. Prior to taking that role, Nikki was a locality team manager for the trust from 2014 and managed a large family support team. Nikki has experience of work in the voluntary sector, also having worked in various youth service settings and managed the young carers services for Birmingham for a number of years. Nikki has a BSc Honours in Psychology and Applied Statistics, an MA in Leadership and Management in Social Work, Diploma in Working with Children and Young People, Management and Leadership and Systemic Supervision for multiple contexts. And she's passionate about lifelong learning and is currently in her 6th year of part-time study of a PhD in social work. And her research is focusing on the role of other agencies in prevention and early intervention, and what they need to be able to respond effectively to the needs of families to reduce incidents of crisis intervention from social work. And finally, we have Ravinder Kaur, who is works for an organisation called Living Without Abuse. Now, I don't have so much information about Ravinder because Ravinder very kindly stepped in right at the last minute to replace somebody who dropped out at the end of the week. So I only really spoke to Ravinda this last night at 6:30 about taking part in this webinar today. So I am completely super grateful that she has stepped in at this last minute, and I will let her introduce herself to you. But I do know that I think she has about 14 years experience working in domestic violence settings. So with that, I will hand over to our first presenter, which is Dr. Elaine Arnull.
Hello, everybody. So I feel like I've got my head very full and centre here, so I'm sorry about that. So I'm going to be talking today about a piece of research that in fact was a PhD piece of work. So it was a funded PhD that I managed to get funding for and had a student working with on, and she is completed and she's now a successful lecturer. And this is a paper that has come out of that piece of work. There's another paper to come out. This paper features at the end, and it's open access, the journal, so you can get it for free. So I haven't always put all of the references and things on there because it makes the slides look quite crowded. And as Susie already pointed out to me, I have 31, so I need to crack on. So this piece of work looks very much at how social work interventions work with mothers who are experiencing domestic violence. I'm going to talk about how mothers are responsibilised for violence that they do not perpetrate, what the evidence is that occurs, and what needs to change. The evidence that we brought together comes from Australia, Canada, England and Wales, and the United States of America. And that's because there are many similarities in the way that work is actually undertaken within social work interventions with mothers and with perpetrators during that period. I'm also, we reviewed all of the evidence that there was on social work interventions with mothers who were not responsible. So it's really important that you understand this right from the beginning, that the mothers in this study were never responsible for any of the violence that was occurring. They were being investigated, or social work interventions were taking place with them purely because they were the victims of violence themselves. And there were no other concerns about their parenting other than that those mothers were experiencing violence. What we found in all of those jurisdictions is that mothers are responsibilised for the violence and abuse that they do not perpetrate, and that this has been ongoing for a long time. And people have been investigating this and reporting on this since the late 1990s, early 2000s. And in fact, the situation has got worse because more and more legislation has come in that actually facilitates this construction. And that's one of the things I'm going to come back to at the end. Now, some of this evidence from a social work perspective is quite hard to take because I'll talk about mothers being blamed, but it can feel like social workers being blamed. Now, as a professional group, we're obviously a group that wants to reflect on our behaviour, wants to think about the impact of our behaviour. So I am asking everyone to very much think about it in that light and think about what we can do that helps to bring about a change. And what we are calling for is a systemic review of current approaches to child welfare, social work, policy and practice where domestic violence is present. And that actually fits with some other reviews that are ongoing. So I think always important to think about this is who experiences violence in a family, who uses violence in a family, and who's held responsible for violence in a family. And that can be a sliding trajectory, obviously, of who experiences it, who uses it, and who's held responsible for it. But whilst there are a wide variety of options within that, overwhelmingly, violence is experienced by women and children. The use of violence is overwhelmingly perpetrated by men who are fathers or partners or husbands, and violence in the who's held responsible for violence in the family is very often the women and the mothers who live within that family. So why consider mothers? And I guess that might indicate why. There are numerous studies in research that look at the incidence and outcomes of violence. So, sorry, my dog's now chosen to bark. So things like femicide, how many women are killed every year as a result of domestic violence? And there are many others that consider the effect on children. The violent person, who is most frequently a man, is really commonly absent from that literature around violence and families, from the academic literature, from the policy literature, and from the practice literature. And really limited attention is paid to the role of the abusive man within that discourse. The focus is very much kept away from men's violence and its impacts on women and children. And the focus is very much more, both in practice and in the literature, on women's actions. And it's the behaviour of women as mothers that becomes the frequent subject of study. Now, why is that, and how does that happen? Is, I guess, the question I want you to be thinking about all of the time in the back of your heads as we're talking about that. Lots of the things that come back are that people social workers don't find it very easy to talk about violence. They're not very comfortable talking about it, and they're certainly not very comfortable talking to people who are violent about their behaviour. So they often speak to other people in the family rather than those people who are the people who are actually responsible for the behaviour that's of concern. Framing our understanding and approach is really important, because obviously all of this sits within a legislative framework. And so in the paper, we go into this in quite a lot of detail, and I'm having to rattle through this today, so please forgive me. But within all of the countries that we talked about, the UK, Australia, Canada, and the United States, the law is expected to treat everybody equally, and is expected to treat us equally regardless of other characteristics that we have, whether our sex, our gender, our race, or our ethnicity. Violence itself is actually delineated by a set of behaviours. So it says these things are violent, and if you do them to this level of behaviour, they form this sort of version of illegality, and these sorts of penalties will apply. And the criminal law says that a person who is the actor is responsible for their violent behaviour, and that person is responsible for any violence that they perpetrate. So if that's within a home, they're actually responsible for the violence that they inflict on that other person. Now, in the UK, slightly later than some of the other countries in the study, we introduced the Domestic Violence Crime and Victims Act in 2004. And within that, we started to talk about violence slightly differently. And this is one of the things we focus on the paper, is this confusion that then becomes in about who's responsible for their behaviour. So in that act, it states that if a child is related to a person who's being abused within a home, so if a child is related to a mother who's being abused by the father, and they see or hear or experience any form of that, then they can be regarded as a victim of abuse. And that is what now triggers most social work interventions, not the violence that's perpetrated against the mother, but the potential effect on a child, or the assumed effect on a child. What the law also now states is that anyone living in that household who is considered to fail to protect that child can now be held responsible, even if they are the person against whom the violence or the behaviour is being perpetrated. They may not contribute to that violence, they may not be responsible for it, but they may be held responsible for it. And that can lead to a penalty of 14 years imprisonment. So when a child welfare investigation is initiated in a family in Australia, Canada, England, Wales, and the USA, it rarely engages with the person who is violent, which is most frequently the man, so the father or the stepfather or a husband or partner. And instead, it focuses overwhelmingly on the behaviour of the mother, and what it considers is her ability to protect or not her children from witnessing domestic violence. And remember, the only reason that anyone is concerned is because this person is the subject of violence or coercive control or behaviour that puts her at risk. And we're interested in this and why this happens. And we think that some of this is to do with how we think about motherhood and how we think about mothers. So many of us have conceptions that relationships shouldn't involve violence and that they shouldn't be about being hurt. But in fact, many of us across Europe, and lots and lots of things that look at culture and expectations around culture and violence, actually show that many of us consider it reasonably common behaviour, and that many of us think that the person who is the subject of violence somehow contributes to that violence, even if they didn't perpetrate it. Within the family, actually, a lot of violence has been legalised. It's been okay for much of our legal history within this country and in others. And again, we look at that in quite a lot of detail in the paper. And that is important to what we call the ontological perspective. So the way that we think about this in a broader context, the way we think about it without even knowing we think about it. So our cultural setting, our historical discourse and our legislation all contributes to the way that we then look at this act of violence on a mother in a home who also has children. And most of our research is framed within that context and therefore takes place within that context. So the concepts of wife and mother and the frameworks of home and the acts of violence are really important in that context, and they are gendered. They're also mainly heteronormative, so we assume that they're mainly based on the idea of a relationship taking place between a woman and a man in which there are also children. These are usually not culturally explicit, and that's why we think they get missed. But it's really important to remember that because they're not culturally explicit and because certain forms of violence have been legitimated, for many of us, they float around in our head and we don't even think about them. And violence in the home, in most of Europe, is treated, and in the countries we're looking at, treated differently inside the family than it is treated if it happens to us on the streets outside. How do we know that we privilege the rights of fathers? Well, there's a whole heap of research around this, but one of the people who brought it to attention was an MP in 2016, who actually raised it in the Houses of Parliament, who said she'd been really shocked when a woman had gone to see her, who actually was able to show that a family court social worker had told her that if her children who were frightened of their father did not visit him, it would be her, the mother, who would be in trouble. And there is a current review by the Ministry of Justice of the way the family courts are operating, and it's reviewing how access and contact with children is actually managed following divorce and separation. And that's really the result of a number of high-profile deaths of children and mothers at the hands of separated and divorced fathers. But I want us to bear that in mind, that that review is taking place. A review of the literature that we undertook actually looked at mothers and what the qualities are that mothers are said to be had. And these are generally ones that are meant to be good ones. So good mothers are those who are willing to lay down their life and sacrifice themselves for their child. And that actually informs a lot of our current practice. Mother blame is said to be where women don't meet up with these idealised constructions. So there's a whole load of research that actually looks at the way women are held responsible as mothers for what then later happens with their children and the outcomes that happen. So a review of research in the 20th century on mothers actually showed that they were blamed for a whole series of negative outcomes. Most of this is psychosocial research. Many of it occurred in psychological studies. Shows that mothers have been held accountable for a whole range of outcomes, including all of those on the screen, many of which were considered to be negative outcomes at the time, even if they might not be now, where things like sexuality. Things like children's drug use and political protests, what happens to them when they grow up, whether they marry and whether that's considered a good outcome, and that these images are also ones that are racialised and have racist implications. These have implications for women who are refugees, who have immigrated into a country, who have different conceptions of mothers and mothering, and where actually black women were held accountable as mothers for men's later poverty or unemployment, not the racism of the system or discrimination within the system, but the way mothers raise their children. So mothers were said to be domineering and controlling and in need of psychotherapy and a need to understand their place in the family. This is all peer-reviewed research. Equally, mothers were said to smother their children if they didn't work and to be neglectful and creating delinquents if they did. They were responsibilised for sexual abuse. There's quite a lot of evidence around the way women and mothers are responsibilised for sexual abuse that they don't perpetrate. And a review of psychologists' files that were looked at the 70s and 80s found that mothers were blamed for 72 different problems of children that couldn't be solely attributed to mothers and mothering. So ideal mothering is something that's elusive and unobtainable, but not reaching it makes people very vulnerable. Scientific language is used to hold mothers accountable, and that insidious nature of the way we don't really think about that and the way that we hold mothers accountable is seen by many researchers to have just become accepted within social work, to the point that it's become common sense. We stop thinking about it. So what's the evidence that this actually has an impact on social work practice? That was something we're really interested in, and there's an empirical study that sits behind this, where we've also investigated it more recently in the UK, but this is this review of the whole literature that exists. And as social workers, we obviously want to be a caring profession, and we don't want to be blaming people who aren't responsible for things. So how is it happening that might be occurring? I've tried to put the names of the researchers at the bottom so you can see them, but as I say, the paper is open access, so you can read all of the research and the evidence for yourself and see where it occurs later on if you want to. Neil says that staff are often overstretched. There's lots of burdens around the work they do, and they're looking for outcomes and results. They're looking for things that they can manage. Therefore, they suggest ignore significant aspects of a case, including the perpetrator's violent behaviour, and that the easiest way for them to get through their caseload and deal with the case is to actually hold mothers responsible. Therefore, they may blame mothers for their inability to manage the violence they're experiencing, and perpetrators therefore continue to behave however they like, because the message to them is that they can continue to behave however they want, because it's actually the woman and the mother who will be held responsible. What they say the impact on mothers is that they therefore feel an emotional burden that also means that they feel blamed by professionals. Somebody called Witt and Diaz have looked at a whole range of themes, having looked at social work interventions, and they said there are 10 main themes. Domestic violence is a really prominent issue in social work, but many social workers consider there's a lack of training. They also think that they have a lack of training around how to assess parenting capacity, that they have empowered mothers to be able to control violence in their own minds, but they haven't really thought about how they might be able to be supported or achieve that. And that there is a lack of understanding about how to work more effectively with multiple agencies, which maybe Nikki's research will be really helpful for in a minute. That there are often poor attitudes towards mothers, a lack of trust between mothers and social workers, and a need to raise social workers' awareness. Now, if we think that many of us as social workers are also women and mothers, that's also really interesting. That social workers reported feeling frustrated by mothers and considered that mothers had a choice, whereas they considered children did not have a choice. And they found that social workers found weaknesses in mothers in order to justify taking the actions they took, which might be around child removal or around requiring mothers to behave in certain ways. And that people use the leave ultimatum, which is a terminology that occurs quite a lot in the research, against the mother, requiring her to either leave the violent partner or lose her children. Keeling and Van Wormer said that mothers reported social workers making them feel defensive and unwilling to disclose any information and fearful of the intervention. And given, obviously, we want people to talk to us about their experiences and to talk to us about how they might feel they can also work with and ameliorate those experiences, actually feeling unwilling to disclose is a really important factor. They said that mothers often felt punished if they didn't comply with demands to separate from the perpetrator or undertake interventions the social workers outlined. And they said that social workers use coercion and threats that they would forcibly remove a child if the mother did not leave or undertake actions required by the social worker. That informed part of the research that we did, which was actually using social work, looking at that aspect of social work interventions. In Humphreys and Absler, they looked at 13 child welfare guidance documents that came from the UK, the USA and Canada between 1900 and 2011. And using content analysis, which is a particular form of research technique, which actually looks at the words and phrases within a document. And they said that there was consistent themes with the invisibility of perpetrators, that domestic violence was treated as a private rather than a public issue, that women were held responsible for the abuse they experienced, and that the repetitive patterns across the countries and across the documentation actually highlighted the structural nature of the problem, which went beyond individual social workers, and that's something I want to return to. And they called for a review of policy responses as well as profound cultural change. So what about the literature that's looked solely at how mothers are responsibilised within domestic violence? And that's the studies we've just looked at and those that bring them together. They've said that mothers subjected to domestic violence are often left to protect and care for children without support. So they aren't given a new home, new income sources, new ways of finding. Then the perpetrators aren't necessarily arrested. They're not protected from someone who's using extreme levels of violence or coercion about them. They're just required to sort the issue out. And that therefore the interventions are punitive and cause them to distrust social workers. And this discourages mothers from seeking help. That mothers are generally caring and protective to their children, and that social workers have blamed mothers and argued that mothers are guilty of neglect and failing to protect children, and that mothers actually internalise that message themselves, and that that's also really negative. They describe a discourse as about regarding the detrimental nature of children's exposure to domestic violence as actually based on a deficit model of mothering, because there's very little research that actually looks on strengths-based models of mothering and how that actually ameliorates many effects of domestic violence. They consider that mothers are often considered as failing, that domestic violence is considered as marital conflict, and that there is a failure to focus on men's violence. And they think that practices and policies actually inculcate those things within them. So it's obvious, often domestic violence is considered, where it's considered to be harmful to a child, actually means that the victim of the violence is actually just made invisible, but made from the violence as a victim, but made accountable for the violence they're experiencing, whilst the perpetrator disappears because no accountability is held against them. And that policy and practice is highly gendered, but it's actually masked by gender neutral language. And you will see that in our own current documents. And Lapierre's done quite a lot of research on this, and those two pieces are from 2008 and 2010. So what social work interventions are being found to do very often is blame mothers for their experience of violence and subject them to scrutiny, whereas perpetrators of violence are not subjected to scrutiny. Social work interventions often focus not on helping the perpetrator change their abusive behaviour, but focus on whether the mother is considered able to protect a child or children or not. And Hartley says that she may be judged as failing to do that because she is considered not to have prevented her child's exposure to domestic violence, which actually means she hasn't prevented someone being violent to her. Concepts of mothering and child protection, some of this work, there's very little that looks around race and the way that that impacts this, but there's some studies. Ramsey is a really interesting recent study in Australia, actually talks about the way concepts of mothering and the concepts that we hold are actually very focused around particularly westernised images of mothers and mothering, and that they can have really negative impacts on mothers from backgrounds different from that of the investigating social worker, and that this can have racist implications, and it can lead to the forced removal of children. The study of Ramsey's is really striking one, actually, and that child protection in the context of domestic violence often works on the concept of the deservingness of the mother to be supported and around these contested conceptions of mothering, and that the invisibility of male perpetrators in child welfare investigations, that means even when the male perpetrator of violence might leave, the only reason this woman's mothering was being investigated was because she was the victim of violence. But in fact, that has ceased to be the focus, and this woman's mothering continues to be investigated, even though actually there was never anything considered wrong with her mothering in the first place. She was just the victim of violence. Goodmark has demonstrated how the leave ultimatum is actually used, and how mothers are charged for not stopping violence, which, as we understand more and more about coercive control, becomes even more alarming. And that's has particular resonance in the USA, but there have been examples of it in the UK, including some quite recent examples. And Douglas and Walsh's study actually shows that some violent fathers were actually held to be satisfactory fathers, and that children were removed from mothers because the mothers were experiencing violence, but the people who were perpetrating the violence weren't held responsible for that. So what are my concluding thoughts? What do we do about this? So domestic violence has been illegal in Australia, Canada, England and Wales and the USA for quite some time, but mothers are still held to account for violence they do not commit. Mothers who experience violence in their home can be told by the child welfare system that they have to leave their home or risk forced child removal or prosecution purely because they are the victims of violence perpetrated by somebody else. So how did this happen? There's a historical division in our cultural responses to violence and abuse, whether they occur in the family or whether they occur outside the family. And this has continued to influence the way we think about violence. Until 1976 in England, it was actually expected that mothers who were good mothers remained in abusive relationships. So the change has been quite quick. What has happened is that mothers are now expected to leave perpetrators without any additional supports put in place, but they're still held responsible for the violence and ameliorating the violence. Legally, they can now also be held to account for any violence that they can't control, mitigate or ameliorate, even if that violence is used against them. There is a current call by the Ministry of Justice for a review of the way the family courts actually consider access to and contact with children in this setting. And I think we should be calling for a review of practices around child protection social work and around some of the requirements within some of the legislation around child protection social work, where violence is being used against mothers who are then being held accountable for the experience of that violence and its impacts on their children. I've actually submitted this piece of work and others to the current also call for evidence against violence against women that the government also has out. And I would hope that lots of social work practitioners will do the same based on their own experience. We here at this institute are also hoping to gain a funding for a large systematic review of the way that we actually intervene across a whole range of agencies with families where violence is used across the region. And this is only one type of violence and one type of outcome. And we're also hosting this whole series of webinars around domestic violence and abuse to actually try and combat some of that sense that there isn't enough knowledge about what's going on in our own area and how we impact that. And so we really want to make a positive difference. So this isn't about blaming people. It's not saying we are all dreadful. It's saying this is happening and how do we make a change? The paper is on here. It's the Arnold and Stewart developing the theoretical framework, and there's also some other work we've done around this area. And I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Elaine. So I just had, well, actually, let me deal with that. There's a couple of things. Ravinda is with us, so welcome, Ravinda, after her computer was buffering for ages, but she is with us, so that's great. And there's been a number of requests for PowerPoints. Now, Elaine has a PowerPoint and Nikki has a PowerPoint as well. Are you both happy for me to share? Because I actually have actual physical copies of these PowerPoints. Are you both happy for me to share them?
Yeah.
And I will put an email address. Yeah. So what I'm going to do for everyone who wants the slides is I will put an email address into the chat. It's a generic email address that that I have access to, and I will if you email that address with a request for the slides, I will just reply and send you both sets of slides, if that's okay. So I will just be when we move on and when Nikki's speaking, I'll add that email address. So there was actually just one thing I thought I wanted to you was talking about actually social workers struggling to talk about violence. Did you find out why that was, Elaine?
Sorry, I've muted myself. Yes, we have, and there's another piece coming out about that. But it's often that people are quite frightened to work with perpetrators.
Right. I thought that was an interest, and I think that's something that's interesting in terms of because it is a big problem, I think, sometimes that we don't think about. We talk about domestic violence, but actually often in a profession that's predominantly women, actually working with female victims of violence against male victims of violence. There's also a high level of people who are social workers. There's a disproportionate number of people who are social workers who have individual lived experiences, some of which will be domestic violence. So you can quite easily see how actually for many people working with violent perpetrators is actually quite a tricky thing for them to do. But I thought that was great. Thank you, Elaine. So we're sort of going to move on to Nikki, who is obviously going to talk about this same issue from the perspective of the local authority, which is where lots of this work is, or where the vast majority of this work is done. Just a reminder to people, any questions you've got, put them into the Q&A rather than into the chat. And because it's easier to follow. But yes, Nikki, I will hand over to you. And Nikki, I'm sharing Nikki's slides. So Nikki, if you just wanted to say when you want the slides moving on, and I will move them on.
Thank you. Thanks, Susie.
I can't
give you a second to load them.
Yeah. There we are. It's all right. Sorry. There we are.
Thank you. Okay, so as in the introduction, Susie said I'm the domestic abuse lead manager, and I guess just to let you know a little bit about that post first before I go into the main presentation. It's a newly appointed role that commenced in January this year, and very much on the back of Birmingham's recognition about the prevalence and the complexity of the domestic abuse that we are faced with within Birmingham. So a lot of my role is going to be looking at practice development, supporting practice, exploring resources, and trying to get some support within the trust to move that forwards from specialist agencies. As well as that, we're making sure we're represented on all the key strategic groups, that our voice and certainly thinking about the child's needs is represented within all them key forums. And actually a lot of what Elaine has spoken about in the presentation just before is very, very close to home for what I'm seeing in practice actually. So if you can move the slide on, please, Susie. Thank you. Right, so I thought the first thing would be useful just to give you an idea about the volume of work that we are dealing with in Birmingham. Now, Birmingham, compared to other local authorities in the West Midlands, I certainly know from local data from the Marriott meetings and from other colleagues, is that Birmingham is really quite unique in the prevalence of domestic abuse and the presentation that we're seeing. Just as a breakdown, we have got 2,576 children open to our family support services at the moment. Now, they are not all specific to domestic abuse, but we know that there will be a proportion within that are opened because of domestic abuse. We've got 1,613 children on child in need plans. Again, some of them will be because of domestic abuse. And unfortunately, one of the things within the data that we've got at the moment is that we're not able to separate that out. And that's a piece of work that I've been working on so that we better understand the prevalence of domestic abuse. We've got 1,273 children subject to a child protection plan at the moment. Now, 797 of them, or 63%, is under the category of emotional abuse. Now, that is the category, as you will likely know, that we usually record domestic abuse under because of the impact on the child living in that environment. So we know that that's 63%, that's 797 children. A large proportion of them are going to be on child protection plans because of domestic abuse. And again, the same with the children in care. 1,915 children are currently accommodated in Birmingham, and 74% of them is a result of abuse or neglect. So again, it's not all of them, but there's going to be a large number of children that are removed because of domestic abuse and what is perceived to be the mother's failure to keep them children safe at home. Can I have the next slide, please, Susie? So, as I said before, I've been doing a lot of work on the statistics within Birmingham, and I have actually been able to get more information more recently. And what I do know is that, so of all the agencies making contact with Birmingham Children's Trust, between 18 to 25% of all contact from other agencies raising concerns about a child is because domestic abuse is the primary concern. That's without accounting for the secondary issues that we find later. So it might be that they've been referred for something else, such as neglect or parental capacity. But when we get out there and do an assessment, we realise that it's actually domestic abuse is part of that need as well. Now, once an assessment, just going back to the contacts, we get about 150 referrals a week, contacts a week about concerns about a child. We accept about 50 of them. So there's 100 children out there that are referred to the early help teams for support instead, because they're not meeting our criteria under the right help, right time. So they're not deemed serious enough. So there is a whole piece of work there around early intervention. And that's something that I'm doing in my role at the moment, is making sure there's a pathway for all families that are not accepted at the front door of children's services to be referred into the early help teams, so that they can be then assessed, supported, and then re-referred back in once if they deem that there is more risk than initially perceived at the point of contact. We get the majority of our referrals come from the police, which is unsurprising. About 68% of all referrals that we receive are from the police. And then the others, it's a mixture of health and schools predominantly. Once a contact has been screened and accepted, it's then converted into a referral. And we know that around 16 to 26% on any single week of all referrals are because of domestic abuse that we accept within the trust. And that is around, say, 50 children a week that we're accepting every week. It's also the highest reason for most parts why we are getting referrals into the trust. There's other reasons as well. Physical abuse, physical chastisement is quite often one of them, but the predominant reason quite often is domestic abuse. One of the things more recently that we've realised is the volume of cases and families that have never been known to us previously. And we don't know yet if that is because of the pandemic and COVID and the impact of that, but we are seeing around 60% of referrals that have never been known to the Children's Trust before. And they're not all little children. Some of these are older children, and they've managed to get through life and there's not been any issue before. And now we're seeing domestic abuse as a presenting need for them. Our re-referral rates is something that I'm keen to address. Currently, of all re-referrals, around 20 to 25% are because of domestic abuse. So there's something there suggesting that we're not getting things right the first time. So we need to go back and think about what that is and what we need to do differently. 96% of all the referrals we accept in the trust, they do need a social work assessment. Some of them might go the 4% to the family support teams, but for the most part, they do need that social work assessment due to the risk that's presenting that we've identified. We've seen that there's no real difference between the distribution of boys and girls. It is impacting on children equally, regardless of gender. So it's for children, it is not a gendered issue. It is all children that are being impacted. We are seeing a prevalence, white British children being referred in at the point of contact. So 48% of all contacts are for white British children and 36% for Asian backgrounds. However, once we accept the referral, that then switches, and it's around 48% of Asian families that need an assessment, a social work assessment, and around 32% of white British children. So there's something there around cultural needs and the impact of domestic abuse that we need to do a bit more further exploration around. And we know certain things like forced marriage and honour-based abuse may heighten that risk. We're currently doing a piece of work around hotspot areas. So we've developed a geo-analysis map of the whole city, and we're able to now look at the areas where there is more domestic abuse and it's more prevalent than others. A lot of it, unsurprisingly, is centred around inner city areas where there is very clearly links to poverty and deprivation and unemployment and other factors that may impact on domestic abuse. We're also trying to map against other presenting needs such as substance misuse and mental health. And what we're seeing is predominantly in the white British population that there is a higher prevalence of substance misuse and mental health within referrals around domestic abuse. So there's some work there that we're exploring currently around what we need to do. One of the real shocking things, I think, for me, and I don't actually know why I'm surprised, because I know it is a huge issue within Birmingham Children's Trust, but we've done 624 social work assessments in 2 months, in January and February. For me, I think that is a huge volume of assessments. Now, a number of they've had varied outcomes. Some of them have been closed with no further action. Some of them have been stepped down to family support. Some of them gone to child in need plans, some of them child protection, and some of the children have had to be removed because of risk. But it just goes to show, as I say, the prevalence of what we're dealing with within social work at the moment. Have the next slide, please, Susie. Thank you. So, laying that land and thinking about the volume of work, we just then going back to thinking about why mothers don't disclose abuse to us, because we know that there's an awful lot of the re-referrals, the not accepting, the denial, and there's lots of reasons why that might take place. We know that usually mothers are absolutely terrified that they're going to make the situation worse. It could end up as a fatality for them. They could end up, killed. And if you look at the statistics, 3 women regularly are dying every week. It's just needs to be addressed. A mother may minimise her experiences or not define them as domestic abuse. And we're certainly seeing that in the intergenerational patterns, so their own lived experience as a child, and then what that means in their own experience as an adult. They're not recognising that their relationship is abusive. They don't know what a healthy relationship looks like. But then there's also the cultural-based reasons why they might not disclose, or they might minimise their experiences. There is worries about being able to express their concerns clearly, lots of language barriers for women, or not able to understand what the abuse is. A lot of people still think that abuse is physical only, and not recognising coercive control, financial and economic abuse, and them other factors, or not being able to vocalise it. So I think as social workers, it's really important that we're able to break it down and ask the right questions and communicate and be more specific around what abuse looks like for this woman. There's a real fear that the child is going to be taken into care, the children are going to be taken into care. So that's another reason and barrier as to why women do not disclose. There's fear the abusive partner will find them again through lack of confidentiality. There is a lack of confidence in services. belief that they won't do what they're promising to do, that they won't hold up their end of the bargain, as it were. So there's that lack of trust as well around professionals and engaging with them. Said already, they might fear death or serious injury as a result of speaking out about their abuse. There's also, I think, for a lot of women, just that hope and aspiration that their partner are going to change, that this is the last time, it's not going to happen again, and they just want the violence to stop. And there's just that hope that if they give it long enough, a bit longer, that things will get better and that they will do everything they can to try and make that happen. And then there's also shame and embarrassment and belief that it's their fault. And if you look at coercive control and the way the whole cycle is set up by the perpetrator, they are really pushed to believe that everything they do, the perpetrator's behaviour is because of something that woman has done and something that they shouldn't have done. So they are built up to believe that it is their fault, the abuse is their fault. Can I have the next slide, please, Susie? So the challenges for social workers, just going back to some of Elaine's slides as well and thinking about that. The suitable training. So at the moment, the available training to social workers is generally held by the local safeguarding partnerships and also by voluntary agencies. They're quite often half-day or one-day awareness raising sessions. Personally, I don't think that is robust enough for a social worker who has to go out there and deal with very complicated, seriously risky situations. So what I'm looking at the moment is a whole systems change around training, and that we are having a more robust training system in place to support social workers in their practice, and that they're able to understand the needs of a woman, the needs of a perpetrator, and the needs of a child. Just thinking about that professional development in that space and support, when you've got a really busy caseload and you're chasing your tail trying to get assessments written, go and see a child, get their views and opinions put into an assessment, how much time are you actually dedicating to professional development? And on the back of that, this jack of all trades, there are so many different elements within social work practice that you need to attend to and know something about. You need to know about mental health, about substance misuse, about attachment. You know, the list is endless. So how do you then give enough time to all of these elements to be able to do your job? It is a challenge and a battle. I think the other issues, resource demand and caseload pressures, it's very, very difficult when you've got timescales to meet, assessments to write. We work in a bureaucratic manner very much. Everything's got to be documented. There is a bit of a saying, if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. So there's a pressure to be writing all the time. That then pulls away from the actual intervention, I feel. Aside from the fact, are we feeling skilled and confident enough to actually go out there and do that intervention? That worry for a social worker, if I go and say the wrong thing, am I going to make things worse for this victim, for the woman? So it is about having the confidence. I did a recent survey with our staff around their confidence levels, and it was really interesting. There were some practitioners that scored themselves at a 0 and some that scored 10 out of 10. But when I worked out the average for each area, what we found was that for confidence in delivering interventions with different groups, it varied. So it was 6.7 out of 10, 10 being brilliant, for working with children. It was 6.5 out of 10 for working with victims, and it was 4.9 out of 10 for working with perpetrators. Now, what I know in practice is that there is this pressure to make the children safe. So what do we do in practice? If there's a risk, we tell that perpetrator to leave. We immediately alienate them out of the process, out of the assessment process. All the onus then, we're saying to that woman, you've got to keep yourself and your children safe. You cannot let that man back in the house. that is victim blaming. We're putting that pressure on the victim to keep her children safe. So that is something that we're working to try and address. That relationship building, it needs to be from a whole family perspective. We need to be building relationships with the perpetrators as well. We need to understand the drivers, what's going on, you know, why are they behaving the way they are? And whilst we're not accepting that their mental health or their substance misuse is causing the abuse, which challenging that and holding them to account, but we're also supporting them as well. So it is about building relationships with everybody. And what we do know is that where we have built positive relationships, we get the best outcomes. So that investment at the very earliest time is absolutely critical to actually having a positive outcome. Can you go to the next slide, please, Susie? Thank you. So just mentioned it before, but if you're on duty and you get a new case coming in at 5 o'clock on the night and you've got to get out there urgently because of the level of risk, you've got to put a safety plan in place. Are you going to be thinking about the whole family, or are you going to be looking at removing the risk? Are you going to be asking the woman to go and stay with her children at a family member's house? Are you going to be telling that perpetrator to leave the house? What do you do? The pressures in practice are very different to the aspiration of how we work. So that whole family working and safety planning, sometimes it conflicts with each other. I believe that there's a continuum of practice around how we approach domestic abuse. So we can go from collusion through restorative practice through to punitive approaches. Now, my belief is, and what I'm trying to move the trust to, is a place of restorative approaches where we're building relationships, we're looking at strengths and building on them. Punitive, as I said before, sending that perpetrator out the house, you're immediately alienating them. To then ask them to engage in an assessment later down the line is going to be very difficult, and you can only wonder, you know, it's quite clear why they haven't engaged. On the flip side of that, we do have instances of social workers believing the perpetrator over the woman. Look, she's a mess, she's crying all the time, she's mental. We hear a lot of that. And actually, when you see a victim who's sat there crying uncontrollably and he's sat there pointing the finger at her, who are you going to believe? And quite often we inadvertently conclude with a perpetrator because of what we see. And we quite often minimise the victim's abilities to take care of her children, and we put more focus and actually more credit to a perpetrator's parenting capacity. So we need to move away from that, and we need to look at restorative approaches around the whole family and working with them, holding that perpetrator to account for his behaviours whilst supporting him to address them as well. And at the same time, that safety planning and thinking about what we can do to reduce the risk. And the one thing I think is about that voice of the victim. That person is going to be able to tell you when you leave that house what will happen to her better than any judgment we can make. So it's very much about asking them questions to that victim, to the woman, and finding out what it is she needs and how we can work with her. And that links into this doing with and not to families. We can't tell them that, you know, if you don't split up with your partner that we're going to remove your children. That is oppressive practice in my view. And it's thinking about changing that narrative on how we can work differently. Again, I'd said before, this onus to keep the woman or the perpetrator safe. You know, we need to hold the perpetrator to account, stop victim blaming. This fear of making things worse, what I always advise staff is to see the woman on their own wherever they can, because they can very much tell you how things, what they want to happen and how it can look and what would make things worse or not. But we need to have that confidence really to be taking action alongside and in partnership with the woman, with the mother. Working in partnership here in Silo, we're doing a piece of work at the moment looking at pathways and mapping out agencies, and we know that there's certain agencies that aren't being engaged early enough. Housing is one. Housing will always report to Children's Services if they've got any concerns, but how often as a practitioner are you engaging with the housing service? If we can work in partnership, it shares the load, shares the information, and we can get a better understanding of what's going on. I think one of the key things that we see a lot is the counter allegations and trying to understand, so who is the actual perpetrator in this? Is it the woman? Is it the man? And that's just thinking about a heterosexual relationship. I appreciate that it extends beyond that, but we see a lot of bilateral disclosures, and trying to unpick that is a real practice issue that we need to look at more. And then the meaningful intervention versus the light touch. As I said, as a social worker and you've got a really busy caseload, how do you provide any meaningful intervention and make a difference? And that's something we're looking at the moment. Within Birmingham, I've just commissioned a short-term pilot with Richmond Fellowship, who are looking at going out with the social workers and doing joint visits where they're holding the perpetrator to account. They're doing coaching and modelling with the social workers about how to engage a perpetrator in a way that's not oppressive, that's not, it's challenging, but it's supportive at the same time. And at the same time, we're also risk assessing and safety planning around that. So we're trying to think about how we reframe that narrative about how we work with mothers, how we work with families as a whole. And I think these are some of the things that as a social worker we need to consider about how we address and how we pay attention to them elements. So next slide please, Susie. And yeah, I wanted to leave you, and it's not for you to answer now, but it's really just to think about what you've heard so far, not just from me but from Elaine. Inadvertently, sometimes our practice is not always what's best for the mother, but what can you do as an individual to think about your practice and address this going forwards? It's a very difficult and challenging question. I don't know if we'll have the answers, but it is certainly something that we need to think about on a more political level as well. It's not just a local level. This is a political agenda, I think, and something that we need to look at in more detail. Thank you.
That's great, Nikki. Thank you very much. I think I was just thinking towards the end of that actually about how some of the things that Elaine had said about how practice around domestic violence has changed, but actually I think that's true of our attitude to perpetrator removal as well. Because I think, and it must be said, is I'm thinking a little bit hesitantly, but if I remember rightly, around the Family Law Act in 1996, that was one of the really big things around that piece of legislation, which was about enabling people to remove perpetrators. But it just really sort of struck me how we've moved, even since 1996, from a position where we were really talking about having the ability to remove perpetrators who were the named person on the tenancy, to a position now where we're questioning, actually, is the removal of perpetrators actually inadvertently, has that been problematic for women and contributed towards this sort of women blaming, mother blaming sort of culture, which I think firstly just makes you think how quickly practice moves on and really sort of embeds how important sort of continuing professional development is, because that's literally only not that far away that we were having a completely different discussion around exactly the same thing, and sort of just like 30 years on we're sort of turning that around in a, well, less, yeah, sort of 25, 30 years on, we're talking about it in completely opposite terms, which I just thought was yeah, quite interesting really. So I think there's lots of things to talk about in that. Sorry.
Yes, no, I totally agree. And I'm not saying that either way is the right way, but yeah, actually we know is our current practice isn't working. So we need to reframe that and think about it differently.
Yeah, it's definitely really, really complex, isn't it? And I think it just speaks to that complexity around having one way of doing things. It really does require a nuanced approach to individual cases, because I think there's no doubt that for some cases, the right thing to do is to remove the perpetrator rather than to put the mother in a refuge. But equally, we need to be mindful that actually removing the perpetrator and putting, do you know what I mean, and leaving the mother may actually inadvertently place responsibility with the mother that actually is beyond her ability. So yeah, I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, and then how actually can she come back and say, well, actually, he came back last night. She's going to have a fear that, you know, if she tells the worker that her children may be removed. So I think it is really important that we think about that in a different way. Yeah,
no, absolutely. So yes, thank you for that. That was great. And I think really, like I say, sort of sat nicely alongside what Elaine was talking about, and I think has given me, I've got loads of things running around in my head. So let's move on finally to Ravinda, who's going to talk to us. Ravinda, I didn't, one of the things I did explain to everyone at the beginning, that you joined us really late because you picked up from someone who had to drop out. So what I hadn't got is a little biography of you. So if you want to start by just introducing yourself and giving people a little bit about your background. I did obviously explain that you worked for We're Living Without Abuse and that you've been in domestic violence for quite a while. But yeah, so I'll hand over to Ravinda.
Thank you so much, Susie. I really appreciate it, and I do appreciate that, even though I'm coming in last minute, but hopefully whatever I will discuss, it will make a sense, and it will give a little positive outcome of this webinar. So as Susie introduced myself, my name is Ravinda Kaur, and I'm a senior family support worker working within Living Without Abuse UAVA project. So UAVA Limited stands for United and Abuse, and we are a consortium of 3 local specialist providers of domestic abuse and sexual violence services in Leicester. So we provide sexual and domestic violence services across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. We are Freeware Living Without Abuse and Women's Aid Leicestershire Limited. That's who we are. And what sort of services we provide? We do provide a helpline in Leicester, and also we got a business line. So if any professionals wants to make a referral to our service, so they can pick up the phone and they can make that referral. Or if they have got any inquiries or any questions, they can ask from there as well. So we have got also IDVA crisis intervention for adults, and alongside with ISVA intervention for adults, again, that's for male and female. We also provide support for young people. So that's a city family service, which is provide the support for age group not to 18 years old, which will be for their families alongside with children. So that support includes one-to-one work and also some group work. So we also go into the schools and do the assemblies. We talk about what is domestic abuse. We talk about, what is healthy and unhealthy relationships and differences between that as well. We also provide the safe home and refuge accommodations. We do have city perpetrator program in Leicester as well. So we have got Jenkins centres who provide that support to the perpetrators if they wanted to make any changes in their behaviour, or they want to improve themselves. We also have got a program for young people aged 13 to 18 years who are using abusive behaviours towards their partner, parent or carers. So child and parent abuse can be covered in that one as well. So for myself, I've been working with Living Without Abuse since we first existed in Leicester City around 2012. So it's ongoing sort of funding we're getting from Leicester City Council. So we are basically a volunteer organisation. We're not kind of like a statutory. So since 2012, we have been getting the funding, so we are hoping we will get that continuity in the future as well. So in regards of today's topic, what Susie put this webinar in, and talking about the mother's domestic abuse and social worker intervention, I'm going to talk about a a case which we have had it, and her name is Lisa. It's a given name, so it's not her real name. She's a 19 years old at the age of today, and she has got a mother who is, she's a mother now of a 19 months old daughter. So mom is 19, Lisa, and has got a daughter who is 19 months old. So I wanted to thank Nikki, because Nikki kind of like sort of touch based when she was talking about you know, the cycle of generation abuse and how it all impacts on people as well. So Lisa is one of that. So I'm just going to explain. I'm going to talk about her. And it's all started out when Lisa was experiencing domestic abuse in her mother's womb, and when her mother was pregnant with her. So she basically introduced to the violent word before even she was born. So when she was born, obviously she has had social workers around her, foster cares, and she was being introduced to the safeguarding teams in school. So she has had a very much abusive childhood since she was born, or before she was born, and she witnessed a lot of domestic abuse between both of the parents. She was caught up into the fights as well. She was being assaulted in between them. So Lisa's mother and father, they split up when her mother was pregnant again with another child, and once they got separated, and obviously after separation, abuse kicked in. The father was quite abusive to mom. He was stalking. Mom was pregnant with another child at that time, and he was quite emotionally and abusing mother, as well as obviously Lisa. And there was loads of coercive and control abuse from father at that time. So as I said, she was most of the time, from very before even her birth, she was around all the professionals. So you can think of any professional, and you can name off any professional. She has had some sort of connection or contact with those professionals. So she had been brought up into that upbringing where there is loads of generation abuse was going on, and her life as a child was quite horrible in that sense. And in school, she couldn't concentrate. She was losing all her confidence. She has had the learning difficulty as well to herself, where she was struggling to read and write at the times. So she didn't get to finish any of her education. And Lisa was then started getting into the relationship from very, very young age. So she was in and out of intimate partner relationships from, as I said, very, very young age. But she was 11 when she was sent into the foster care. And she was kind of like not very settled into the foster care home either. She was really struggling, having lots of difficulties around her settlement with the foster carers. So it was not only one foster care she went into at that time. So she had never kind of like made any positive connection with any of the professionals from day one. So as I said, she met so many professionals, and we sort of like counted them, and the figures were like, she was faced with over 100 different professionals, and including all the main multi-agencies were working with her from that age. So Lisa met a young person at the same age in a care home who was very abusive towards her. So she was got into a relationship with this young man, and he was physically abusing her. He was also emotionally abusing her. He was coercing and controlling her behavior as well. He also kicked her out of the house at one point, totally naked, and she was on the street without any clothes, and people were kind of like making comments passing by. So she was really started losing her lack of confidence, and there was no self-esteem where she could say, oh, I can make any step, or I can talk to somebody. And remember, she already had not any trust with any of the professionals either. When she was going back after the ending of the incident, so she was going back with the partner or this person's house. She was trying to find herself, making more busier, trying to cope with her, trauma she went through at that state, or any incident took place. She was kind of like trying to recover from there, and her coping strategies were just cleaning, and she will kind of like use the spray. She'd started liking the sound of the spray and cleaning everything and wiping down or reorganizing surfaces in her own way, how she could kind of like make her feel satisfied. That was her one of the coping strategy from that abusive behavior. One day, foster carer found that Lisa is pregnant, and social services were informed at that point. As we kind of like, as I said, from day one, Lisa never trusted social services or any other professionals. And her first response was, as soon as social services got involved, that they will remove my baby from me. So that was her first response. So pre-birth conference took place, and it was decided that because of the high risk of the nature, the abuse she was experiencing, they will remove the baby. Proceedings will start, and she was concerned about the baby. She was concerned about the baby, that obviously they're not gonna leave the baby with her, and she was quite upset and sad about it. But at the same time, she was not making any attachments with a baby during the pregnancy, because she has had in her mind that she's going to lose this baby. This baby is not going to be with her once she's going to give the birth. During these proceedings and meetings, the chair of the strategy meeting asked that they realized basically that Lisa didn't have any DV support worker, or DV services are not involved at that point. So they then decided they're going to make a referral to Living Without Abuse, and we will basically then support Lisa from that point. Initially, when social worker made the referral, she made a referral to us, to our children's service. Basically, it's just a basic support for a young person who may have witnessed or experienced any sort of domestic abuse. So we will give that support to that young person, either one-to-one or in the group setting, as I said earlier. And from there, we will also provide some sort of group support. But when referral was being assessed, we find out that it is high-risk case, and she is in an interim relationship as well, and she's pregnant. So referral was being made to our young people IDWA worker, and who basically then took the case over straight away, and she started making connections with the foster care parent. Young person was trying to avoid as much as she could not to engage with the service, and as we know from her experience, she has already lost all the trust and faith in all the professionals. So she tried her best to avoid any meetings with the young people IDWA worker. IDWA worker didn't give up. She was having a visit to the foster care mother's house every week, once in a week for 4 weeks, and she was talking to her mother, and it was always been acknowledged in a sense of that, to let Lisa know that your support worker is here. Whenever you're ready to talk, you can come down and speak to her. But she was always F off, and I don't want to talk to anyone. So that sort of impression she was giving for next 4 weeks. Slowly and steadily, she eventually decided she's going to come into the room, and she's going to sit down, and she's going to listen what they're going to talk about it. So the IDWA worker, one thing said, I know what's happening, and I am not here to separate you from your partner if this is what your thoughts are, but I am here to protect you and make things better for you and make sure that you and your baby are safe. Slowly and steadily, they have built up that relationship and trust. She started talking to IDWA worker, and from that point, she was talking to IDWA worker every week, at least once a week, face-to-face for a year, and a couple of occasions during the week as well over the telephone. So she started having that engagement with a support worker who she started trusting and having that faith in her. The year she had the baby, it was she was removed from that area as soon as the baby was born. In regards of the perpetrator, his name was Paul, and he was obviously having some sort of contacts with Lisa while she was pregnant as well, which was again some sort of abuse going on and carrying on, and Lisa was trying to be more faithful towards his relationship as well. At the same time, she was getting more confused about her relationship with him, and also the child who's going to be with the unborn child as well. So she was kind of like having some sort of contacts with Paul as well, but there were times where she was kind of like, oh, I'm giving up, I can't cope with it, it's enough now, and she's coming back to her foster care's home, and she's having that some time away from him, and recreating herself and putting herself, preparing herself more in regards of the baby. But still she has had that thing in her mind that even though this baby is her baby, but it's not going to be her baby once the baby is going to be born. So she was not showing any attachment towards the unborn baby. She never expressed her love or affection towards, even touching her tummy or talking to foster care about baby was not there, so she knew that it's not mine and it's going to go as soon as I'm going to give the birth. She would talk about it when the baby was born, and then she started showing some sort of connections, and she was like, I know it's not going to make any difference, but I do feel that, I love my baby. And that was a turning point, and she had made some contacts with, with the foster care in a positive way, where she was not getting on, or whenever she was not very happy, she was lashing out, or she was taking that aggression out on anyone who she could in that way. But at that point, IDWA worker and also the foster carer, they both noticed that, there is a change in her. That was the turning point, really, with one day we have gone through, and we all talked about the child and her needs and how we can progress with her. So now she was sort of like clearly with the visual of that, I do love my child. And when the baby was born, obviously, Paul has had some sort of unsupervised contact, which was again arranged by the social services, but it was stopped soon because he committed a crime which was not related to Lisa, and he was sent to prison. And obviously, since then there is no contact with the child. Obviously, Lisa was struggling with certain things, and Lisa also found out that Paul is having a relationship with another girl, and he's kind of like moving on as well at the same time. but he still wanted to control Lisa in a way of he could control. He started saying things like, I ever found out that you bring another man in my child's life, I will kill you, even though he's still in prison as the day of today. And at the moment, IDWA worker is still, young people IDWA worker is still working with her, and they are planning for a non-molestation to take out, because he will be soon out of the prison, which we still have got a couple of months, but yeah, he will be still out, soon will be out of the prison, but non-mol will be in place. But we are also looking into arrange her move from city to county to just sort of like minimize everything, as we know, you know, thinking about her her relationship, and also Paul making statements and threatening and controlling her in certain ways. At one point, she did think that he has changed, and she thought that he's going to be a good father, but that didn't last for very, very long. So now she's not thinking about him at all. Meanwhile, what we have kind of like arranged a group support for her, and that was You and Me Mom group. And it was tailored around her needs, around her learning difficulty needs, and it was also delivered to her in one-to-one setting rather than in a group setting. And even though the staff who delivered the support sessions on You and Me Mom group was from Living Without Abuse, but because of the trust she has gained with IDWA worker, she wanted her IDWA worker to be present during those sessions, which was fine. And we sort of like created the package around her needs, and we managed to put that together for her. Gradually, she started to have built up some positive relationship with her social worker as well. When IDWA worker was trying to do the things, obviously, then they have had a very positive partnership working going on for this mom. She did establish some sort of relationship and trust in a social worker, and but obviously there is always a fear in mind that what I will say and what will happen, and what I can say, what I can't say, as Nikki said earlier as well. You know, sometimes it's a fear in a parent's mind that the first thing comes in their head is they're going to remove my child, they're going to take my child. So that was Lisa's story, where she was feeling that if I will say something and if they don't like it, what's going to happen next? So now she's having a support from outreach worker as well. So it's overlap support, and she's quite happy that she's getting that support. If you ask Lisa today, after so many years of her support from Living Without Abuse and from other professionals, her answer, if you ask her how you feel today, and her answer would be, I have been given that answer by the IDWA worker, because she asked her that, and she said, I am great and I am glad that I am not with him anymore. And I'm happy that I still have got my child with me today, and I love her, and I love her in bits. So she's a very, very proactive mother now, and she's doing extremely well. And I can proudly say that she has actually broken that cycle of generation abuse, and she's a very caring caring mother at this time and day today. So this is all about Lisa, but yeah, it has taken a while for her to come out of all these obstacles and start trusting people again and having faith in themselves as well, in herself as well, and in them as well, because it's not easy for anyone who has seen that much in their life, and specifically from that young age, and it was ongoing. And as previous speakers said, you know, it becomes norm for some of the families. It's even for children, you know, from that young age, it's acceptable. It's nothing wrong with it. You know, my mom had it, so it's okay for me to go through, you know, because it's nothing new. It's no difference for them. The impact, obviously, Lisa have had it throughout of her life was the lack of confidence and lack of trust, and also obviously she has had a massive fear that her baby will be removed from her. Also, there is a shame as well. At the same time, some sort of blame was coming from the perpetrator as well, and other family members could be possibility. Not specifically maybe in Lisa's case, but in other cases we know that there are shame and blame comes in quite often, and it's not just from the perpetrator, it's from the extended family members as well. And I think in regards of the social workers to get to know a little bit more about domestic abuse, I would recommend, I would say we have had student social workers who come to our service and they have done the placement, but I think there should be something in place for them to have a real experience working with at least a DV victim who they can learn and think and do some planning around them to understand how DV victims they do survive and what kind of things they go through. So yeah, that's all from myself. Over to you, Susie.
Thank you, Ravinda. That was really interesting. And it made me I sort of nearly fell off my chair when you told me that this young woman had 100 professionals involved with her at some point. And actually I think there are lots of stories in social work, we hear about the number of social workers that young people in care have. But actually, I think perhaps we don't think about the number of professionals that some people come into contact with. I think, yeah, I'm not sure how I would respond to having 100 professionals involved with my life. And I can see how that can happen, particularly for a young person who's a care leaver, but who also has services from child protection and other things. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I agree with you, Susie. But when a worker this morning, she told me that figure. She gave me she goes, actually, we sat down and we calculated how many professionals actually have been in contact with this young person from that age. It was quite shocking, and it's amazing, you know, when you think about it. And if she was having that barrier in front of her, we can now understand why she was having that barrier. You know, why she was herself not to talk to other people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there's a real challenge for working with people. I think it's perhaps another webinar, but that is working with and doing child protection proceedings on young women who've never been parents before, because I think there's a huge difference in assessing someone when you've got some prior experience, something to look back on in terms of what their parenting has been like. But when you're trying to assess the impact that domestic violence is having on someone's parenting who's never parented before, I think that's a complexity that perhaps we don't talk about often enough, really. And the danger in that is that the collateral damage is the mother, who then loses their child, because it's easier to do it that way than actually to really get your head around what is actually a really complex piece of assessment, to assess the impact on something that's yet never happened, or the potential impact of domestic violence, that the domestic violence has happened but they're no longer a mother. So you're really sort of assessing something that's really quite ephemeral, quite so difficult to nail down. So yes, I think that's I think there's lots of challenges in that. So I will get on. We have got 14 questions. We won't get through them all, but hopefully we can get through some of them. There was one I just want to, Katie has asked, have you seen any differences or new trends with domestic violence as due to COVID? Now, Katie, I'm not going to answer this question simply because not next week, not next Wednesday, but the Wednesday after the session there, we've got a whole webinar looking at how services have responded, domestic violence services have responded to under COVID. Yeah, then the next session, which unfortunately I don't have a link for Eventbrite, but it will become available in the next, I'll try and get that sorted today or tomorrow, to get the link set up. I will put it on Twitter for students at Wolverhampton and for people working in the local areas. I will send the email round with the link on it. But for other people, you can either search through Eventbrite or look on Twitter. We are hoping to get a landing page which may make it, will make it much easier for people to sign up to events. At the moment, it is a little bit hit and miss. So Twitter's probably the best place to see when it comes out. But yeah, so we have that there have been some really interesting things that have happened during COVID in terms of how different services have responded. And hopefully we've got someone from a local authority, a women's, hopefully someone from Women's Aid, and we've got someone, well, myself and another lecturer from here are going to look at some research that we've done during COVID on how people have responded. So there's so I'll start with some of the questions, sorry. So Joy asks, is there a difference between how female social workers and male social workers apportion blame to mothers for violence against them? I'm going to ask this to Elaine. I don't know whether, Elaine, you will have an answer for this in your work that you've done, because you do quite a lot of work around violence and how people conceptualise violence.
In the literature, they don't very often explore it. So in the literature that I talked about in the paper, it's not very often explored, other than to people noting that most of the social workers are women. In the piece that we did, that my PhD student did, actually, I think almost all the social workers are women, apart from I think one or two are men, and the responses are very similar. Actually, I think there was no difference, but that's a small sample. You know, I think it's 15 or 20 interviews. But overwhelmingly, the social workers in the studies are women, or predominantly women. So I don't think there is any apparent difference.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It must be said is I don't know of any sort of, I have some anecdotal views on whether there is a difference between men and women. I think there's definitely perhaps a perception that there's a difference. And I think one of the things is, if you look at the way cases are allocated, men are more likely to be allocated violent cases, but how those male social workers then respond to that violence, I'm not so sure about. Whether actually they are better placed, I'm not sure that that's not based on just entirely on stereotypes, the fact that happens within social work, but it is a factor. Nikki, do you have a view on that as a social work?
Yeah, I think it's very much grounded in your own internal biases and values, isn't it? And I think that people's responses are grounded in that. And I don't know about gender and if there is a difference between male and female social workers. I have certainly seen in practice where male social workers sometimes can escalate issues because they're standing up in front of perpetrators and becoming more assertive, and that can inflame things. But yeah, I don't know what is the honest answer. I've also seen female social workers who can be quite, you know, argumentative and assertive as well in practice, if that's for want of a better word, I guess. So I can't really answer that, but I do think that people, I do hear a lot of, I don't understand why she doesn't just leave. and that is from male and females. So I think it's that understanding of the whole process generally as a whole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's an interesting, I think that's absolutely true. I think actually that's probably speaks to the fact that I wonder sometimes whether there is a large part of social work which is about dealing with aggression and dealing with violence, and I wonder I wonder whether actually we spend enough time thinking about that and preparing social work students and working with social workers who are engaged in practice with those types of aggression. And sometimes it's very passive, I think, and sometimes it's very difficult to put your finger on it. But when we go back to what Elaine was saying about the social workers are fearful, perhaps as agencies, as educational institutions, we need to be more mindful that actually that's problematic and provide some solutions to it and some consideration of it.
Yeah, I think, Susie, in terms of as well, like it very much what Nikki was just saying, it's often that irritation or that blame of mothers that why don't they just leave? And I think part of that is because that solves the problem. And if you look at the volume of work that Nikki's talking about going through, the assessments at the minute, people are looking for that solution, and that's a solution. And I think partly it is because people feel they have few options. You know, they can't just change or make it go away. You know, like Ravinda was saying, you know, that often these situations are so complex and so long-lived that actually unpicking them is going to take a lot of time, and people don't always feel that they have that time or don't have that time. So I think all of those things roll in. So because one of the things that we had expected to find was sorry that women who were mothers might be more sympathetic. But actually that wasn't found, that women who were mothers were often less sympathetic. In fact, if there was anything, there was a greater correlation of anger with women who were mothers who were social workers than there was. So in terms of the gender thing, that was quite interesting.
No, that's in the dog barking. That's okay. It's one of the occupational hazards of being at home. So Ravinda, I don't know whether there is anything you want to add to that point about your experiences of male and female social workers.
Nothing to add, but it's very similar what Elaine and Nikki said. You know, it's a very mixed sort of response, you know, and especially why she didn't leave earlier. And we know that why they didn't, because that was not the time for them. It was not, they're not ready to move out, or they're not ready to have those challenges in their life, or they are comfortable at the moment and they can't see even if they can support themselves financially, you know, to move on with their own children. So it's going back into the question, you know, it is a very mixed sort of review. I have had it, as well as how Elaine and Nikki said. So, yeah.
That's great, thank you. So I'm going to deal with the next. I'm going to give you two questions now. So Christine has said, someone who is just finishing my degree in social work, how can I further my interest in domestic abuse and violence? And I know how I can individually do things in my own practice, but how can I do more? Are there agencies or organisations I can become involved with? And I think that's probably an important question, because I think Nikki, you were saying that social workers have to be these jack of all trades, and actually developing an interest and finding out how you access the sort of training and the ability to develop your own knowledge in these areas, I think is perhaps important. And it is good that Christine is looking to do that for herself. And then Greta said, what can be done about enhancing working with the police and probation services? So Nikki, do you want to go first on those questions?
Sure. I think there's lots of opportunities to work in partnership with other agencies, and that's where your multi-agency work comes in, spending time talking to agencies and understanding their role, their remit, getting their perspective on how they manage the case. That will help you learn. There is lots of bits of training out there, keeping attached to that training opportunity wherever you can. I don't know if you've got the capacity to consider any volunteering. A lot of the agencies would take volunteers potentially, certainly places like Refuge as well. You could do some part-time work, evenings, weekends, and support places like that. But I think it's very much about building and growing your networks, and trying to get as much information as and when you can. Research as well, and lots of reading. There's so much information out there that you can access as well, so that really helps. And then I've forgotten what was the second part of the question.
1 second, I shall get it back up again. And then the next question was, what can be done about enhancing work with police and probation services?
Yeah. So certainly within Birmingham Children's Trust, we do particularly Section 47s. It's a joint 47. We'll be going out doing lots of joint visits, joint working with them. Wherever we get reports about domestic abuse from the police, I always encourage staff to engage with the police, find out information. We've got early help police officers in Birmingham as well, and I believe that model's been rolled out across the West Midlands. So linking in with them, getting them out on joint visits with you if you can. Certainly we work with probation a lot. We work with, and under the Domestic Abuse Act actually going forwards, prolific offenders are going to be managed by MAPA. So making sure if it's a MAPA arrangement that you're attending their meetings, it's multi-agency risk assessment from PPU. Same with MARAC, get into MARAC, they can support with a safety plan, police are involved, probation potentially. So it's really about, again, them networks, getting the opportunities, getting some key points of contact wherever you end up, and really joining forces. But we do work a lot in partnership already with them agencies. Yeah. But there's always room for improvement as well.
There is. And it's a complex picture, isn't it? The number of agencies that are involved in working with domestic abuse. And I think that's one of the things that makes it really complex. And they're all working from slightly different perspectives. And I think that's one of the issues around the sort of mothers, children and social work interventions. This is where these issues arise, really. You've got the police that are very much focused on public safety and the sort of criminal aspect of it. You've got probation, which are focused on the perpetrator as a perpetrator of abuse. You've got social work that's very much focused on children. And then these voluntary agencies, broadly speaking, like Ravinda works for, who tend to focus on mothers. But actually what you've not got is a service that works, that sort of those things are linking through organisations or through sort of bodies like MAPA and MARAC. And I'm not necessarily sure that the functioning and of those organisations is as good as perhaps it could be, given that these organisations actually do work on different aspects of domestic violence themselves. And I think we do know, Elaine could confirm that actually since MARAC has been introduced, I think it's been introduced about 10 years, that it's actually, despite its initial aims, has had no impact on domestic homicide. Yeah. So did you want to come in on that, Elaine?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, and I think that's the thing, we do all work together, and I think there are real people work very hard at trying to work well together, and to increase understanding, but we haven't had an impact yet. And I think that's something that I know I'm really interested in. I know you are, Susie, and I think quite often it is because each individual agency has their own aim. Many of the aims are focused around the concept of risk and negotiating or managing that risk, but often the risk that we haven't taken particularly seriously is the death of the person who's subject to the violence. So often the risk is focused around the child, and not around the woman, the mother, who's most likely to be killed. So I think it's partly around those sorts of things, and where we focus the risk and the concern and how we look for solutions together. But I think it was really interesting, the question about where would I go? How do I keep up my interest? Because actually it is quite hard work doing those things. And I was just thinking, maybe as part of these series, and when we get our landing page that we're talking about, actually we could have, like, you know, links to various things that people might be interested in, that they might follow or look at, because I think it is hard. You do have to find it for yourself. You do have to look for those connections. You know, as Nikki said, access to there's tons of research, but accessing it can be quite hard if you're not still attached to a university and don't have links into a library and all those sorts of things. So yeah, I think that might be something we could also think about. And I did notice that Vicky Lang has put in, Welsh Women's Aid, she's always really happy to talk to people and engage with them. So I think as well, in the area you work, it's quite often finding the other people who are interested like you and who's doing the work. But you do need to put the work into that. It's not easy, I wouldn't say.
Yeah. Can I just say on the back of that as well, in the trust, what we've developed is domestic abuse champions model. So because we've got nearly 2,000 staff, we've got one representative from each team across the trust, and they come to a bi-monthly meeting where we have agencies come in, talk about what they do. We'll do training. I also do a bi-monthly newsletter on the month that we don't meet, and share information with new services, any information like updates on the Domestic Abuse Bill Act. So we use that forum to really try and link back, and then them champions go back to their team and share that information to try and support and develop practice. So it's about being creative in your thinking about how you can develop your knowledge, and how we do that as a system as well. It's not just an individual.
Sorry, yes, that's really helpful. Thank you. Ravinda, I'll just remind you, do you want me to remind you of the questions? There was one about just, let's say, getting involved. And I think I'd come to you, but actually I know that you developed, actually one of the things you developed in COVID is ways that people can get involved in your organisation voluntarily. And then obviously the engaging with police and probation, which again, I think that you have projects within your organisation that do that. So yeah.
We yes, definitely. We during the COVID, obviously, we sort of like continued with our service and delivering that service to all the adults and children. That's obviously only available virtually, but we are constantly on Zoom or Microsoft Teams or over the phone and providing that support. Going back to your first question, I think it was in regards of how to get that knowledge and experience. It is because obviously social workers, I think they have got a very special hat on them. That's how I describe them, because obviously they have to have that specialism in so many different things to deal with one family. It's depend on even if it is just the DV, if it is mental health, if it is drug and alcohol going on, or various other things, so they have to be kind of like ready for any challenge from that prospect. So I would say in regards of just the DV, speak to, as Women's Aid said in the message as well, speak to any of these organizations, and I'm pretty sure we are all happy to share any sort of information. Any questions you have got, you can contact us and ask and talk about it. Any case you're going to get, or you are practicing on something, just ask questions. That's the best way to move on, to learn from things, and if you can volunteer yourself, all the volunteer organizations, they always look for volunteers to come forward. Go and join them, even if it's not full day or half day, couple of hours will actually give you loads of knowledge around the subject. It could be any subject. I'm not just talking about domestic abuse.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I'm going to try and quickly just squeeze in. We've got 5 minutes, 2 last points, which I think are a couple of things. One point that's come up a couple of times, and that is where I think either where you're working with sort of claims and counterclaims of domestic abuse, which I think we have in some. It might be worth going back to some of the other particularly the webinar on coercive control, where that came up again. But I think it's a fair point, is working with where you've got one person claiming a domestic abuse and then the other person claiming domestic abuse as well. And then the other point was about the Domestic Abuse Act. Sharon asked, which I think is a good question, is now the Domestic Abuse Act is in place, how will this affect the way in which social workers will look at the effects of mums and children in safe accommodation, not necessarily refuge? And again, I know that I think Nikki has been doing quite a lot of work around that, if I'm not wrong. Is that Nikki? Do you want to?
Yes, so the Domestic Abuse Act has put a new burden on local authorities where they have to provide safe accommodation and support for victims of domestic abuse. So now that is not just refuge, that's across the board. So we're currently working and scoping out, each local authority has been given a grant allocation to spend, and we're currently looking at that at the moment and what that needs to look like. We know that there's not enough refuge accommodation already. We know that there's a lot of victims who want to stay in their own home. They don't want to move, understandably so, and uprooting from everything they know. So it's about that sanctuary scheme and support to put safety plans in place and keep them safe in their home where it is possible. Some of them might need to be relocated and moved, but the Domestic Abuse Act is very much focusing on that now and making sure that all victims are safe. And then obviously the definition's been extended to include children within the Act now as well. So children are included within that as well to make sure that they're also supported. We're currently scoping out as well trauma-based, trauma-informed practice and support for victims of domestic abuse, and that support to sit alongside the safe accommodation. We haven't got all the answers at the moment, but it's something that we're currently working on and trying to work out what the best approach is in terms of meeting that demand. Yeah. And then the counterclaims thing, I think, is really difficult as well. I think it's really important listening and speaking to them if there's any other supporting evidence. Sometimes you can never make that decision. You can't work out who is telling the truth. I know research suggests that women very rarely lie about their experience of domestic abuse, whereas men are more likely to do so. But again, that's not to say that a man might not be telling the truth either. So it's a very complex thing. Something I'm looking at the moment and thinking about tools that can support that that curiosity and that routine inquiry about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder whether there's an aspect of this that links back to the fear, because actually that there is, social workers are often working with contested problems, whether that's a child says one thing about an injury and a parent says something completely different. I mean, this is stuff that we work with on a daily basis in children's services, definitely, is allegations and counter allegations. And I think probably there is the sexual abuse allegations are even worse than in terms of being able to gather the evidence. In some ways, physical abuse is a little bit easier in that you tend to have some physical evidence present. That's not necessarily the case with things like domestic violence. It's helpful if there is, I think, but often in these cases, particularly with coercive control, that's not present. But I do think it's that sort of, I think there's probably, again, it's about understanding how you develop an understanding about what's going on when you're working in cases where there are contested issues you've got to navigate contested views on what's actually happening. But like you say, and again, I think going back to what we've talked about, perhaps this is another reason why it's easy just to say to the mum, well, actually, let's edit the perpetrator out of the picture, because it makes that problem a lot less complex, having to navigate between different allegations. Ravinda, do you want to come in on any of those points?
Well, I just wanted to add on. I know that at our helpline, they have got the assessment going on where they can kind of like assess it if it is a victim or a perpetrator. And I think it's mainly from Jenkins Centre, it's coming from under the Respect toolkit, and I think that's what they use. But yeah, that's how they basically differentiate it if it is a victim or perpetrator, and then they refer the clients accordingly, you know, from their assessments.
That's great, thank you. And Elaine, and we're nearly there, but it's, do you want to quickly respond? I know you've responded in the chat.
Yeah, I was going to say I popped it in the chat because I thought we probably needed to leave. But really interesting questions. But I think as well, the more you get alongside somebody, whatever their role is in the family, you know, whether they're the person experiencing violence or the person who's being violent, the more you understand what they have to say and their perspective, the more you'll have a better understanding of what assessment you would make. You know, because relationships may have levels of contested violence, but actually it you know, where power lies and how violence is used to get people to do what you want may well be very different. And
which
I think
is
it's worth remembering that.
Yeah, and I think that is something for people who are interested in that if you go back to the webinar on coercive control, there was a reasonably lengthy discussion about that. And I think it is about identifying the power probably within that. But yeah, perhaps we've not got time to review that. So I'm going to draw the webinar to a close. I'm just going to, again, just reiterate the next webinar is actually going to be looking at how services have responded to domestic violence during COVID, and what we found out about that, and then later on at the end of June, the final webinar is going to be about looking at children's social care and the changes that have taken place in children's social care within COVID, and what we want to move forward with and what we don't want to, what we think has not worked. And at that we'll have Isabel Trowler at that, and we'll have the assistant director from Wolverhampton. We're going to have a student on that, and a social work practitioner from Birmingham Children's Trust, and I can't remember her name right now, so I'm very sorry about that. But yeah, so that panel is pretty much sorted. So hopefully we'll see some more of you there. But thank you very much for coming today. The recording will hopefully be up by the end of tomorrow on the YouTube channel for people who didn't finish seeing it or who are wanting to share it with other people. But thank you very much, everyone, and we hopefully will see you again. Thank you.
Susie.